So just a little bit about me. I have covered the media industry for 20 years. I also spent about a decade as president and editor-in-chief of Digiday Media. And Digiday Media is the home of Digiday, obviously, which is focused on media and marketing, as well as Glossy, which is focused on fashion and beauty, and another publication which we actually did launch, this is a little out of date, called Modern Retail. So one of the great things about, my background, at least that I think, is that I've been covering this, but also living it for the last 10 years, because we were, an independent media company that was building a sustainable media business. And that informs a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. So first thing is, I think you've been hearing a lot about this, about accelerations, and media is no different. Anytime there's an external crisis, I think that puts a lot of stress on industries, companies, obviously on people, and it accelerates trends that were already happening. Okay, so I think the one that probably we all know is e-commerce, right? So e-commerce has leapt ahead. It's been accelerated 5 years by some measures by this crisis. The fact that, at least in the United States, we can't really go out to a lot of shops often, this is happening in the media world without a doubt. And if you were on the path to moving to a subscriptions model, this was an opportunity to accelerate that. Now, if you weren't already, it's really hard to play catch up. Even this, doing this event through Pine AI, the event tech, virtual events, video conferencing, these were all around. It just accelerated, I think, what was happening. So a few of the accelerations. The end of the scale era is definitely one of them. The writing was on the wall for this strange era that we were going through in digital media, in which a lot of venture capital went into publications with the idea that they could build gigantic scale and monetize mostly through advertising. The advertising market itself was severely commoditized, obviously, by Google and Facebook. And there have been a lot of challenges to this model. I think, just the last couple of weeks, there was a merger between BuzzFeed and HuffPost, I guess now, here. And, if this happened 5 years ago, it would have been enormous, earth-shattering news. But when it happened now, it was mostly, here's a couple of weakened players getting together. BuzzFeed's a lot stronger because they had diversified their model into commerce in particular. But Huffington Post, the terms of the deal, Verizon was basically paying BuzzFeed to take Huffington Post over. And that, I think, says a lot about this scale era that was ending, because it exposed a lot of weaknesses. The next one is the strong get stronger, and this happens in these crises, because if you're strong going into the crisis and strong with both a strong balance sheet and a strong business model and a strong culture, you'll come out on the other side, most likely, if you execute correctly, a lot stronger. And the flip side of that is the weak get weaker. And we see this with players like the New York Times. The New York Times, about 7 year ago, started on a path to decouple itself from depending on advertising in order to move to a direct-to-consumer model that is driven by subscriptions. And now they have 7 million, but they had millions going into this crisis, and they're using that to get even stronger. They now have been poaching talent from, they have the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed. They've rated Vox Media for some of their top editorial talent. They're able to do that because, again, they have a strong model. I think of, in the business area, Business Insider, I know they've hired several of my former colleagues because they are able to, with the backing of Axel Springer, but with a strong model built around subscriptions, they're able to amass a lot of talent that will help them coming out of this period. The other one, before I get into the DTC model, is this pivot to paid. I think this is absolutely critical. This does not mean that advertising is dead. Nothing is dead. Anyone who says something is dead rarely is true. But when it comes to subscriptions, it's just a far more reliable model for media. It doesn't mean that advertising cannot supplement that, but advertising typically is an add-on for these kind of sustainable models. And that's because subscriptions are, you get recurring revenue, and that is a much more powerful model. I think we're seeing subscriptions spread throughout all sorts of different industries. And with advertising, when this crisis hit in March, it fell off a cliff. And that's the thing with advertising. It's a variable model. It allows, it can be turned on and off, and that can hurt publishers. And I think, publishers for a long time relied too much on advertising. And it is an indirect model that led them to make some very strange decisions. And, one of the things is when you're dealing with an advertising model, it's an indirect business model. So you've got an audience and you have customers. The audience are the people you're creating content and trying to attract their attention. But then your customers are the people you're selling ads to. And so sometimes they come in conflict, and usually the customers win out. And when the customers are not the audience, that means the audience loses out. And that's why the experience of going to websites can be so terrible, because the needs for the advertiser are put ahead of the audience. Okay, so DTC media, what does this mean? Direct to consumer has sprung up in e-commerce as a reaction to the wholesale model. So the idea is that it would be much more efficient to go directly to consumers and have a much cleaner business model, a much more efficient business model. There are differences in using this with media, but I think that overall and I think when I'm thinking about it, there are a few different areas in which this plays out. One, on the consumer area, is in passion plays. So you can have specific areas in which you focus in on and that consumers are very passionate about, and that you can build great businesses around. Think of something like Barstool Sports. I'll talk about them later. They're very focused on a sort of young male demographic who is interested in sports, but is really into gambling and sort of rude jokes. But there's also, we're seeing a lot of journalists leave and other content creators leave for places like Substack, which is actually where my new newsletter, Rebooting, is. So if you want to Google the Rebooting, you'll find it. It's therebooting.substack.com. And I think what we're seeing there is, people who are able to differentiate by focusing on a specific area, are able to build their own audiences. And the other one is micromedia. I think that there is a gigantic opportunity to create smaller collectives of media that are more efficient than typical media models, and we'll see more of that. So let's get into some of the characteristics of DTC media. One is that it is built around community rather than audience. In this scale era, a lot of people talked about their gigantic audiences. They would come on a podcast. I hosted the Digiday podcast, and they would talk about billions of views and how they got hundreds of millions of visitors. But what they weren't saying oftentimes is this audience wasn't really theirs, right? It was just, it was people that they were getting through platforms. And so it was actually the platform's audience, not their own audience. But ultimately, an audience-based model is less strong than a community model. And by community, I mean like a group of like-minded people. Okay, I think my background in B2B, it's all built around community, right? You always want to have like a community of like-minded people who are trying to figure out the same challenges. Whether that was in media and marketing or whether it was in fashion and beauty. We used events to bring them together and to connect them with each other, to connect them with information that helps them do their jobs better. But there are areas in which you can do this that are not B2B. I mentioned Barstool, but one would be like Hodinkee. It's for people that are just really into watches. Okay, and that is a strong community, and you can build a very diverse business model based on that when you find the community and put yourself at the center of the community. The other one is by its very nature, this is a more focused media entity. So I think when you're talking about advertising, you typically need large numbers, as large of numbers as possible, in order to make a sustainable media business. And that's because CPMs go down. I mean, that's just the truth. Advertising got commoditized, and so in order to make up for that, publications went as broad as possible. When you're in a DTC model and you're depending on your audience is often your customers, you can be more focused. And in fact, you have a stronger business if you're more focused versus being broader. And that's a very different dynamic. And I think you make very different choices on that. And one of the different choices you make is you choose to be differentiated. I know a lot of publications talk about differentiation, but the truth is when everyone's was chasing the same Facebook trending topic or trying to get the same SEO juice from Google, that leads to a lot of sameness, right? And if you're trying to connect with an audience and mean something, or not an audience, a community, and mean something to that community, you're going to end up emphasizing differentiation way more than if you have a broad advertising-based business. The other one is, I think at DTC, you end up having more diverse media business models versus monolithic models, that were typically about advertising. That's true. And these kind of diverse models allow you to have a lot, I guess, to sort of de-risk a little bit, because if one thing is down, the other things can make up for it. And I think we saw this at Digident, and we had like 11 different ways to make money, whether it was events or awards or advertising or sponsored content or memberships, and that made up for when the fact that when in-person events went away, a lot of that revenue really went away. I mean, because a lot of the value is in the interaction, and this is a great tool that we're using, and it allows us to all come together from around the world. But at the same time, it's not typically as valuable for sponsors as an in-person event. I hope it's different here. But to have a diversified model makes up for that quite a bit. So the other one is the direct models versus indirect. As I said, the advertising model is an indirect model. You are serving two masters, and that is really, really difficult. A more direct model, whether it is based on getting subscriptions or whether it is based on selling products, because in the DTC world, e-commerce world, we've seen a lot of companies start as media and move into being commerce, and I think that's a really powerful. The key to be able to do that is you have to build that community, like I said before. But a direct business model is simply a lot stronger, and everyone is going to need to make money a lot of different ways, and it's best, if it's possible, to have your audience be your customers, because you will run into far fewer conflicts when that is the case. So I just want to get to some quick takeaways, because I know we're doing some lightning fast sessions. One is, again, community. I can't emphasize enough that community is far better than having an audience. It's really hard to do, it's really, I think this is another one where a lot of people talk about having communities, but they don't necessarily truly have them. They actually might have an audience. But if you do have a community and you can put yourself at the center of it, you're going to have a much stronger business. The other one is being direct is just far better than relying on advertising. Does not mean that advertising goes away. I think advertising is incredibly good. It can be a very high margin business. I think, when we see in with newsletters and with podcasts, different forms of advertising can have far greater value for both the advertiser and the audience. I just think that in general, if you're able to go direct to your consumers, then you're just going to have a lot more confidence in the sustainability of your model. And finally, brands are more important than websites. And I think in this time of tremendous change, I think what we're seeing is that people with strong brands will will arrive on the other side in good shape. There were a lot of people who thought they were building brands, but really were building websites. And I think the big test of that is, if you go away, will people miss you, right? And a lot of publications went away in the last few years, and in truth, not many people have truly missed them. And so that means zeroing in on the content and what makes you different and what makes you valuable to the community that you're serving. So with that, I want to turn it back over. I want to thank you. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. And again, if you want to visit the Rebooting, just Google the Rebooting or go to the rebooting.substack.com. Only publish once a week. It's not too much, I promise.